Hey everyone, I just want to say we're going to start in another minute or so. Just please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, and thanks for being on time or being early. Okay, I'm going to kick us off in just a second, just making sure that we have the people that are trying to get in. So thanks everybody again for being on time today. Okay, yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and let us start because I like to, respect everyone's time. So, we wanna get you in on time, get you out on time. So just thanks again for being here. I'm gonna kind of click through a couple of quick things and then turn it over to our presenters, Ted and Linda. But if you wouldn't mind, just for the time being, go ahead and drop your name and your organization into the chat and say hello. Oh, sorry, I just saw a chat, Chris saying she had some trouble with the link. Thanks for letting me know, Chris. I'll check on that as soon as I pop out of here real quick. So again, welcome. We're with the Nonprofit Center today. And of course, the Nonprofit Center exists to connect, strengthen, and advocate for a strong nonprofit community. We do that in a number of different ways, but I know all of you online today are familiar with our programs and services. So, please feel free to reach out if you have any questions about that directly to myself or to Morgan, my colleague who's also on the line today. I do want to give a quick shout out and thanks to the Community Foundation for Northeast Florida. We actually approached them about adding a series of trainings to our roster this year around kind of sector repositioning and helping you all to, kind of bounce back and talk about the topics that matter most to you when thinking about the COVID-19 pandemic, our civil rights movement, kind of everything that's going on right now, just how are our organizations positioned and what could we be doing to be better positioned and more sustainable in the light of all that we're experiencing. So thank you to them. And of course, my name is Callum Brown. I'm a program director at the Nonprofit Center, and I'm joined by my lovely colleague today, Ms. Morgan Owens. So please feel free, if you have questions, drop them in the chat. But if there's something that maybe you don't want your name attached to and you want to ask it anonymously, you can toggle over that chat box and chat directly to myself or to Morgan, and we can read your question out loud. So we don't have to say, Chris Hoffman told me to tell you, but no, we can ask it for you. And then, just as a side note, if you wanted to rename yourself and make it a little easier for us to know who you are, you can also do that. So you can find that in your little participants ribbon. So a couple of quick Zoom things, but I know all of you all that are on here are very comfortable with our kind of Zoom platform we've been using the past couple months. And then last but not least, I am going to actually end my screen share and throw it over to Ted and Linda. We're so excited to have them here with us from Risk Alternatives. We have done a bunch of work, thankfully, with Risk Alternatives in the past year, 2 years, around things like risk management and scenario planning. So I'm just really, really excited to have them here today. And I want to quit talking and welcome Ted Bilich.
Alan, thank you so much. And on behalf of both me and Linda, we want to thank you and the Community Foundation for being willing to bring this topic up and hold it before your members. There is so much to be, so much to be worried about these days. We face unprecedented circumstances, and the best we can do is draw upon our network of connections in order to look for long-term resilience, robustness, and sustainability. I am honored every time I get the chance to interact with the Nonprofit Center, because you all have that in your DNA, and you do such a good job of bringing people together to be more than they could be individually. So thank you very much. By way of background, this is about a 75-minute presentation, but you are not going to be allowed to be potted plants. You are going to be involved every step of the way. Linda and I have a potted plant behind us in these photos, but that is not to make any suggestions that you're allowed to do that. All it is to introduce us, and so you can know that I am a recovering attorney. I have about 30 or 40 years of legal experience. I came out of Harvard Law School back when clay tablets and styluses were still in fashion. I have actually known Linda Lenrow Lopez since long before law school, since I was about 16 years old. We went to the same high school in Ohio. She then went off and had this amazing career as a risk manager for one of the largest private engineering firms in the world. When I decided to start Risk Alternatives back in 2012, I tried to pull her away from that organization, and she wasn't ready at that point, but she eventually was willing to join me. And so together we have decades of experience in risk management and nonprofit work, and from my perspective, teaching and legal counseling that we draw upon when we provide our information in webinars like today. Like I said, we've got about 75 minutes, maybe a little bit less now that we've had our introductions. There will be a break. I'm not going to promise that it's going to be a 10-minute break, but Linda and I recognize that death by Zoom is a potential phenomenon. We understand that if you are sitting still for 45 minutes in even an exciting webinar, it's hard to pay attention. Furthermore, we understand that almost all of you are working from a home or non-traditional environment. That means that rather than just having to deal with potentially annoying coworkers, you also have to deal with pets, children, spouses, microwaves going off. You are going to have a chance to take a break and deal with those sorts of issues right around the midway point. But like I said, it will be a fairly brief break because we have lots of interesting things to discuss. When you want to pose questions, you can put them in the chat function. Linda is going to be monitoring that, as is Callan. I will also try to have an eye on it, although it's sometimes hard to do both things at once. So Linda may end up interrupting me and say, hey, Ted, put a cork in it. Someone really has an important question here. And if so, I will try to honor that. But if you want to ask a question, here's the rule of thumb we're going to use. In addition to Callan's point that if you want to be top secret about it, you can send her a private message and she will announce the question. We're going to give you a pass. We're going to assume during this presentation that if you ask a question, you are not asking that question on behalf of your organization. Instead, you're asking for a friend. You're asking for some other organization like yours that might be facing the context that you are describing. So you are not putting yourself or your organization on the spot, by asking a question, by disclosing something, by asking clarification. You are not doing that at all. We're all giving you this rule as a pass to be able to be free with your questions during this webinar. Finally, I ask you, I know it is hard in any Zoom context to be truly active, but we are going to ask you to be interactive with us at times. I'll tell you when I'm asking a rhetorical question. Otherwise, I'd kind of like you to respond when I ask a question. And you can respond by typing something into chat, or at times what we might be doing is I might be using the raise hand function in order to have you all sort of give me a sense of the virtual room in some way. And I'm sure you're all familiar with that, but we'll try it out at some point. In fact, let's try it out right now. If you know how to use the raise hand function, can you give me a show of hands? Oh, I see some hands being shown. Thanks, Chris. All right, I see a lot of hands showing. It's on your board. I forget exactly where. Linda or Callan, do you know exactly where it is?
Yeah, if they go into participants, which is on that ribbon that could be at the bottom or top of their screen, and they click on participants, there should be an option in that little box that pops up, like invite, mute, or sorry, not invite, but it'll say raise hand.
Cool. Yes. But I see that most of you have already got it, and that's great. And those are the ground rules. Here are our objectives right now. The objectives are threefold. Number one, I want to give you the case for scenario planning, why scenario planning is so important, even in normal times, and how COVID might make it even more important. Second, we're going to give you an approach for scenario planning so that if you wanted to do this within your staff, if you wanted to do it with your board, if you wanted to do it with stakeholders, you would have a tool, a workable tool to use immediately without expending any money to do it. And then finally, we're actually going to take some steps to do part of a scenario planning as part of this webinar. It's hard to do it virtually when we haven't had a chance to really interact as a group before, but we're going to make the effort, and we've had real success when we've tried this before. So let's get started. First of all, the case for scenario planning. You might think, why am I giving you the case if you're on a webinar about scenario planning? You'd be saying, Ted, come on, we get it. We care about scenario planning. That's why we've given you 75 minutes of our lives to try to learn a little bit more. I understand. You all get it. That's not the important thing. What I want to do is I want to be able to load you up so that if you have skeptics within your organization, if you have skeptics on your board, if you have people who are saying, my gosh, why are we spending any time doing scenario planning, that you're able to say, I'll tell you why, and here is why. Scenario planning is critical for any organization. You're going to hear me talk in the next few minutes about the fact that scenario planning is very different from predicting the future or forecasting. Forecasting attempts to say exactly what will happen. Scenario planning does something different. Scenario planning presents a possible future so that you can reflect on that future critically and make decisions about it in the present. In other words, scenario planning is not trying to say what will happen. Instead, scenario planning is about hypothesizing that something has happened and thinking about what you'd want to be doing then and what you can do now in light of that. So scenario planning is very different from forecasting. Here's one thing that we're going to do to gather some data that we'll use in the second half of this presentation. I'm going to ask you about two scenarios, okay? What I would call them is sort of the bad case scenario and the recovery scenario. In a moment, we're going to ask you to answer 4 polling questions about these two different scenarios. So you're going to answer two questions about each one of the scenarios. You're going to be asked, how likely do you think the scenario is? And then you're going to be asked, how confident are you in your prediction? I'll show you the 4 slides that capture these notions, and then we will open the polling. Callan will allow it to be open for a little bit so that you can answer all 4 of the questions and then submit. I think that you won't be allowed to submit until you've answered all 4 of them. And don't worry, although I'm not going to tell you the answers that you gave right now, you will learn the answers in the second half of the presentation. So here we go. 4 slides about 2 scenarios. The first scenario is a scary one. It's November 2020. And for whatever reason, whether it's because the president has decided to not give up the White House after being kicked out, whether the Democrats are saying they're going to kick him out even though they didn't win, whether it's because of COVID, whether it's because of recession, whatever it is, there is so much uncertainty that your organization is facing a 10% shortfall in revenues year over year relative to 2019. In other words, you don't have as much money to spend going into the new year as you had going into 2020. So your questions that you will answer about that are, number 1, how likely is that scenario? And the way you'd answer that in the poll is, if you think that's unlikely, you'd put a 1. If you think that you don't know for sure, you'd put a 2. And if you think it's likely, you'd put a 3. Okay, so in answer to the first question, 3 would mean you think this is likely to happen. 1 means you don't think it's likely to happen. The second poll question is going to have the same scenario, but instead it's going to ask you differently. How confident are you in the prediction that you just made? Are you 80% certain that you're going to face a 10% reduction relative to 2019? Are you 50-50 on this? Are you 10% certain? So how confident are you in your prediction? Then you're going to answer 2 questions about a different scenario. And this I would call the recovery scenario. And this one is a lot happier to think about. It's November 2020, and the economy has actually rebounded. COVID's under control. The elections went off without a hitch, and the Florida economy is once again humming. So your nonprofit is at least at the same level of revenues that it had in November of 2020, if not greater. Same 2 questions about that. The first one would be, how likely is that scenario? With 1 being unlikely, 2 being, I don't know, and 3 being, I think that's pretty likely. And then the 4th question that you'd answer is the second question on that scenario, which would be, how confident are you about that prediction dealing with the rosy scenario? So again, 4 questions about 2 scenarios. The bad scenario, how likely do you think it is and how confident are you? And the good scenario, how likely do you think it is and how confident are you prediction of that? Callan, let's open the polls and we'll give you about 1.5 to 2 minutes to fill them in.
Okay, the poll is launched, so you should be seeing it in front of you, but I'm waiting to see if we get any responses. Okay, good. I see a response coming in, so you guys are seeing it.
So I haven't lost you yet. More than half of you have done it. Good job.
Yeah.
Come on, guys. And women.
Okay, let's see. Just seeing if we have answers in all 4 polls. Okay.
1 minute warning. See, everything's on a condensed scale here.
Yeah. I think that's the majority. I don't see any other like movement coming in. So why don't we go ahead and end and share?
That sounds great. Although don't share yet, please.
Okay, I will.
I'll tell you when to share. Hold it for right now.
Okay. So the polls ended, waiting to share.
Great. Okay. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. All right, folks. Thank you so much. Now let's talk about predictions a little bit. And here, this is not a rhetorical question. Let's say someone came up to you with a prediction about an event in the future. What sorts of factors would you consider would be important in trying to determine whether you should believe and count on that prediction in making your decisions about the future? Throw some things into the chat, some considerations that you'd want to think about in trying to determine whether you should believe that person and act on their advice or their prediction. Character and track record, absolutely. Thanks, Mark. That's a good point. How long range the prediction is. I love it. The reliability of the source. Oh, Chris asks, what about the last time they made a prediction? Their experience and knowledge, lovely. You guys are very active and absolutely on point. Where's the data coming from? So Tracy would want to have some transparency. What are they drawing on in making this decision? Well, yeah, Julia makes the great point, and hi, Julia. She makes the great point about, how much data they've asked you before trying to provide the relevant prediction. So do they have awareness of the variables that may be at stake? Such good feedback. When Linda and I brainstorm about this, we captured many of the things that you all did. In fact, I think you captured almost all the ones that we did. Many of you said, well, we'd want to know something about how knowledgeable the predictor is. We might call that expertise. We might want to know how much brain power the person has in terms of practical or situational IQ. There's a different thing than straight out brain power though, right? We might want to know how much life experience this person has had. There's a reason why, even in our culture, which values youth so much, when we're looking for advice, we tend to look for seasoned, grizzled veterans. This is one of those few circumstances where me having gray hair and loss of hair actually makes me a more credible source of information, because you can see that I've experienced bumps over time. You can see the tracks of my tears. You know that I've got something that says I bring practical experience, maybe something someone might even call wisdom to this prediction that I'm making. Someone said, what was their track record? If they've hit 7 of the last 7 predictions that they've made of this sort, you might think, okay, they're worth actually paying attention to. Here's one that you didn't mention, but it's a really important one that I'd ask you to think about is, I would want to know, is this person more of an optimist or a pessimist when they make predictions? Because believe it or not, people have what's known as pattern bias. There is such a thing as someone who consistently overestimates or underestimates their own confidence when making predictions. There is such a thing as someone who always sees the glass half empty versus someone who sees it predictably half full. So I would want to know about pattern bias. Here's something else that y'all didn't raise, although I know that it's common sense to you. You'd want to know whether this person's trying to sell you something. You'd want to know whether there was some sort of positional bias at stake, right? Whether they were trying to persuade you or whether they were dispassionate or objective. We always want to know what's the hidden agenda. Many of you, Julia and others, talked about, what are they accounting for? What assumptions are they making? And while I don't necessarily agree with the former Secretary of Defense on many issues, I do agree that there are such things as known unknowns and unknown unknowns. You can talk about, here are the assumptions, the express assumptions that a predictor is making in making that prediction. But then you'd also want to know about what is the context of background uncertainties. If we're dealing with a context in which the predictor is dealing with a steady state situation, something where not much has changed and there's no real expectancy of profound discontinuity in the immediate future, then maybe you'd feel more comfortable accepting that person's prediction. But if reality is going back and forth like a metronome, as it is, given the fact that it is March 147th or something like that, 2020 by now, because in this unprecedented situation, it seems like no one's needed to flip the calendar from one page or another since March 11th of this year. In those sorts of circumstances, you might feel, oh my, there are a lot of unknown unknowns. So even if this person has been 7 out of 7, we might not want to value their prediction as highly as we might otherwise. But even if someone has really strong track records, even if someone is very bright, it sometimes pays to be skeptical about predictions. Let me give you just a couple of for instances. In 1932, Albert Einstein, he said there's not the slightest indication that nuclear energy will ever be obtainable because we'd have to split the atom and that's inconceivable. Decca Music, back in 1962, said, this guitar thing, it's on the way out. We're not going to sign this crazy British band that's been playing in Hamburg called the Beatles because rock and roll might be here to stay, but this sort of guitar music is done. Western Union in 1876 says the telephone has so many shortcomings that it's just never really going to be feasible. Henry Ford's lawyer was trying to decide on whether he should invest in the auto industry. His financial advisor said, no, smart money's on horses. Automobiles, they're a fad. Thomas Watson, the visionary founder of IBM, in 1943, here's a guy who actually had a stake in this industry. And he was asked, well, what's the market like? And he said, I think there's probably a market for about 5 computers. I think he was a couple of orders of magnitude off when he said that. Darryl Zanuck in 1946, coming out of World War II, consumerism is just becoming a force, but Zanuck was pretty darn confident about one thing. Television, it's not really going to work because television requires people to sit and passively stare at a box in their living room, and no one's really going to want to do that. But just lest you think that only these sorts of predictions happened way in the distant past, look at Steve Ballmer's prediction from 2007. 2007, the iPhone is being introduced, and Ballmer, then the CEO of Microsoft, is asked, well, what about this iPhone? What's Ballmer's response? There's no chance that the iPhone is going to get any significant market share. So, I don't mean to tell you that you should never pay attention to any predictions. That's not the message that you would want to share with your skeptics in making the case for scenario planning. But what I do want to say is while it's okay to ask, what do you think is going to happen? And why do you think that? You should always answer those sorts of questions with humility. And if someone does answer those questions, having you ask them, well, you should always make sure that you take their answers with reflection and inquiry. In fact, I'd take it a step further, and This is a slide that Linda's never even seen before, but I think there are actually some rubrics that we can use about predictions. In the extremely short term, predictions may be accurate, especially if they're made by people with knowledge. For instance, if someone is standing outside and they say, it is likely to be continuing to rain 10 seconds from now because I am standing outside right now and it is currently raining. Well, they are in a position to know, and they are making a very short-term position or prediction based upon readily acknowledged phenomena. Rain tends to continue happening over the extremely short term. In the same way, if a weather forecaster looking at Doppler radar tells you there's a 90% chance of you getting a thunderstorm in the next 45 minutes because our modeling shows a thunderstorm coming toward your jurisdiction, again, very short term, pretty good chance that that prediction is right. Let's look at the very long term. The long term is hard to predict with certainty, but it is quite often fairly simple to predict on average. Now there's a significant proviso that I'll give you on that I have on the slide, but let's think a little bit more about that. This is why when someone is talking to you about the stock market, they will say, in the short run, it goes up and down and up and down and up and down. But over time, if you invest money in the stock market regularly, you will more likely than not see a return on your investment that's higher than if you simply put that money in the bank. Now, that is not always the case. It is possible that there would be some significant discontinuity, some economic cataclysm that would make it that putting money into a long-term investment like that would not give you a rate of return that the person is talking about. However, in terms of averages, sometimes it's possible to predict averages in generalities. In the same way, if you ask a weather forecaster, what is it likely to look like on September 15th in Jacksonville? The weather forecaster won't be able to tell you whether it's going to be raining or not, but she likely will be able to tell you, well, the high is probably going to be somewhere between 95 and 102, and the low is probably going to be somewhere around 70 to 75. She'll be able to give you ranges in terms of weather that, while you can't be certain, there may be a significant discontinuity. It may be a hurricane has just come through, and so it is significant. There's a cold front after it or something like that. But on average, sometimes predictions can work if the person is knowledgeable and if their data source is reliable. It's that uncomfortable middle where things are troubling. The medium term can often be literally impossible to predict, and it should always be viewed with some skepticism. So if I were talking about rubrics for predictions, these are what I would use, and this is why I would say in times of uncertainty, scenario planning is better than forecasting. Scenario planning, again, is not an attempt to predict the future. Scenario planning instead is about talking about a potential future in order to assess what you might do now in response. It's a way to unpack assumptions and get greater clarity about the current day. Briefly, before we go on our break, I want to give you the elements of scenario planning. Basically, if you were going to do scenario planning in your organization, you'd do something like the following. You would describe the scenario. Sometimes you'd want to describe the scenario in great depth. Sometimes you can just use a simple paragraph like the ones that I gave you earlier in this presentation. But you'd set the scenario, and then you'd discuss 3 questions about that scenario. And I'll take each of these in turn. The first one is, how likely is the scenario? And I can see some of you smiling right now because that sounds like a forecast, and I'll get that in a second. The second question you'd ask is, what would we want to do, or be prepared to do if that scenario came true? What would we want to do then? What would we want to be prepared to do then in that future? And then finally, the third question of scenario planning would be, in light of our answers to the first 2 questions, what do we want to be doing now in the present in order to be better prepared for that possible scenario, given the likelihood and our other reflections on it? All right, let's unpack those questions, because after you'd go through those questions, then you'd do a debrief with your team. And I want to talk to you about how you use these questions with your team. Question number 1, how likely is the scenario? Well, yes, it sounds like I'm asking a forecasting question, just like it sounded like I was doing earlier in this presentation when I asked you those polling questions. When you're asking this question of your group during scenario planning, yes, you want to get some sense of what people think the future might be, but the reason why you're doing that is not just to get that sense. You want to find out what the assumptions are. You want to find out why people are making the estimates they are and how confident they are of their estimates. You want, in asking that question about how likely the scenario is, you want to play with your team in terms of devil's advocacy. You want to ask, what are the various opinions and how might those assessments be wrong? And also, as part of this first question, when you're talking about that first question with your group, you might see coming out of those discussions some criteria that you would want to look for that might be early warning signs of that scenario coming true. You might be able to say, oh, if this, based on everyone's expectations, if this happens in September, maybe it's more likely that this is going to happen in November, and so on. So first, you ask, how likely is the scenario? Second question you'd ask, as I said, is, what would you want to be prepared to do then? This is an opportunity in this part of the scenario planning exercise for you to provide your future selves some advice. This bears on an important cognitive theory point. When we're in crisis, it is hard to make important decisions. In crisis, we tend to get tunnel vision. That's why scenario planning is so important, because scenario planning allows you, before the crisis happens, before the scenario has come true, if it ever does, it allows you to think about, what would we want to be able to do then? What advice would we be giving our future selves then about what we should be doing and what we should be prepared to do? This question also would allow you to talk about what potential impacts you might see if this scenario came true, because what you'd want to be prepared to do would depend on what impacts you would expect from that scenario. And it would also allow you to ask that question, what would you want to be doing in response to those impacts? Finally, the third question, what should you be doing now in light of your answers to the first 2 questions? In other words, you've talked about how likely is it, you've talked about what you'd like to be in a position to do then, So what do you do now? Are there things that you should research that would provide greater clarity as you move forward in these times of uncertainty? Are there areas of what we might call optionality, ways that you can create things now that, if that scenario comes true, would help you avoid downside and maybe even take advantage of upside? So are there things you could do now in terms of creating options for you if this scenario came true? Where are the areas of leverage within your organization based upon how likely this scenario is and what you'd want to be prepared to do? Where can you most maneuver your organization right now so that later on you can take advantage of upside and avoid downside? And then finally, when you're talking about what you should do now, maybe the discussion in this scenario planning exercise would give you the chance to say, oh, we should be tracking this and this and this in the short run so that we have better ability to handle the long run potentiality of our organization. So scenario planning allows you to think about the future in a constructive way without necessarily committing your organization indelibly to a path. It's a tremendous tool. And now what we're going to do, I promised you a break. We're going to take a very short break. On this short break, what I want you to do is step away from your computer, stretch, check in with your spouse or your dog or your email or whatever, but you're going to come back at 15 past the hour, and we're going to finish up the rest of the session. And what we're going to do in the rest of the session is going to be fun because we're going to talk about that actual scenario, the negative scenario, and we're going to talk about what you should be doing now about that scenario. All right? So take your break. 4 minutes from now, we're going to come back online, or actually at quarter past the hour, we're going to come back online. Keep the link open. And can you do a show of hands if you can hear me talk? Cool. And thank you, Callan, for both hands. All right. Well, I wanted to start out by answering a couple of questions that we got in the chat. One question was, Karina, you had asked whether there are any variables or metrics that are useful year over year to look at and for how long. You know, I think that will vary from organization to organization. Unfortunately, when you talk about economic variables, I'm not sure that there are economic variables right now that I think would be good predictors of what we might be facing 6 months on, 12 months on, or so on. However, if Karina, you're asking about variables that your organization might want to track, that's something that you and me and Linda could have a conversation about offline, and feel free to shoot us an email. We'll have our email at the end of this presentation. Betsy, you asked the question of, you know, what do I mean by leveraging the organization? You know, one thing that anyone who's been on one of my webinars would know is that they should always be careful of asking questions, because I always recommend books. There's a book by Peter Senge, S-E-N-G-E. It's called The Fifth Discipline. It was written in about 1989 or 1990, and it's about systems theory and how organizations are systems, and so they react in strange ways when they get shocks to the system. And he talks about how a system has places of leverage where if you make a little bit of a change, you can get a big effect. And so that's what I mean by leverage. And I could give you some practicalities, Betsy, if I knew a little bit more about your organization in particular. But for instance, it may be that you could talk to your customers and find out that you could tweak a program in a way, your beneficiaries. You could tweak a program in some way that would allow you to unlock a lot of value for your beneficiaries, your clientele, without you expending a lot of money. Those sorts of leverage points are extraordinarily important in organizations, and it requires some real thought, and scenario planning allows you to think about that because it allows you to think in terms of what, you know, people sometimes talk about, the butterfly effect, where a little change now can have an enormous change down the road if you are thoughtful and if you take steps, you know, in a deliberate fashion in order to change your organization. So that's what I was talking about when I talk about leverage points, although they will vary from organization to organization. Now, we only have a few minutes left, but I want to take us through a little bit of information about how we would deal with that shortfall scenario if we were actually going to do a scenario planning exercise about it. So here's the scenario again. It's November of 2020, and we're facing a 10% budgetary shortfall. When I asked you about that, these were the sorts of results that we got in the polling. And of course, you know, you guys were making predictions. You are nonprofit leaders, but on the other hand, y'all are, you know, lay people. You don't have specific expertise. And even if I might own a crystal ball, that crystal ball has never, ever worked for me. So we ask this not in order to necessarily say this is the definitive truth. On the other hand, I think this is valuable data for all of you to be able to sit with. Because when we asked organizations like yours on July 22nd, 2020, how likely it was that a nonprofit of the sort like you are would face a budgetary shortfall of 10% or more, 63% of you, almost 2/3 of you said, yeah, that's a pretty likely scenario. That's an important data point. It's an important data point for us to consider when we think about, well, should we prepare in case that scenario comes true? We always like to ask comparison questions because it helps round out a scenario. So I did ask you the comparison scenario, which was the bounce back scenario. And when I asked that bounce back scenario, about 50% of you said the bounce back scenario was likely. And then 25% of you said, yeah, I don't know. And 25% of you said, I don't think that's likely at all. You'll see that the confidence levels varied between the two questions. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to actually share the actual polling results so that you could see them if you wanted to. But you'd see, you know, like I said, it's most people thought the first scenario was likely, but you see there's variability in the confidence levels. Then when you look at the same or better revenues, it's not necessarily as optimistic about this one, nor are you as confident in making the prediction. Okay, well, that gives us some data. We know that a lot of nonprofits are feeling this way. When we did this presentation the last time, we got about 75 or 80% of the nonprofits in those communities who were saying they think that it's likely for a nonprofit to face a shortfall in November. So people are fairly pessimistic. To me, that means it's certainly worthwhile to think about the next question, which would be, what would you want to be doing or prepared to do then? Now, if we had lots of time on this webinar, I would actually ask this question as a non-rhetorical question. I would ask you to provide response to this in the chat, but we don't have all that time today. So instead, I'm going to give you a list of things that Linda and I have brainstormed about things that a nonprofit might want to be in a position to do in November if it's facing a 10% budgetary shortfall. One point that's critical is you'd want to be in a position to have identified and protected what is core about your organization. What are the core services that you provide? What are the core things that you'd want to be able to provide even in November, even if you're facing budgetary shortfall? That's an important consideration. You'd want to be able to provide your core services. You want to be able to have business continuity sufficient to do so. You might think about program changes. You might want to be in a position to have done more of this program and less of this program. You might want to be in a position come November to be executing on that reallocation of programmatic resources. You may want to have done something with respect to staffing. Now that doesn't necessarily mean staffing cuts, but it might mean that come November, you'd want to have reallocated your staff based upon your expectation that you will face a new reality come November. One thing that you might be thinking about doing if you were in November and you're facing a budgetary shortfall is you might want to be in the process of making various sorts of performance improvement initiatives. If you can make some sort of process improvement initiative that would save resources or unlock additional value, maybe you'd want to be in that position by November. You might want to be taking risk management initiatives. You might want to, if you're thinking that you may be facing a budgetary shortfall, you might want to have done a risk inventory, prepared a risk register, started to have risk management be part of your everyday discussions. That might be something that you'd want to do by November. You might also want to do either extra fundraising or different fundraising as a result of facing a budgetary shortfall. When I say different fundraising, what I mean is you may think that you can't go to funders and tell them what you're facing and tell them what your fears are. But I tell you, having dealt with not just the Community Foundation in Jacksonville, but scores of foundations around the United States, your funders are receptive to the concerns that you face. If you tell them about what you expect and you provide data that shows them what you're facing, you might find that they are willing to provide money and additional resources that you didn't think were possible. You might want to be in a position to get a credit extension come the fall. You might want to be in a position of having talked to your banker and figured out a background line of credit or an extension of your line of credit. You might want to be in a position in November of having established new partnering relationships. You might want to be in a position in November to have been building your network so that you have a stronger network of connections. And finally, come November, you might want to be in a position where your board is involved in a way that they currently are not. Now that's a lot that I've put up on the wall there, but I put it up on the wall because these are things that you might want to brainstorm with your staff if you went through this scenario. Because let's think now, in light of the fact that people worry that this scenario might come true. And if you wanted to be in the position come November to do some of those things that I listed on that prior slide, and which I've listed again on the left-hand side of this slide, well, what do you want to be doing now so that you're in a position to do some of those things then. For instance, if you want to be in a position, perhaps, to partner with other organizations come November, well, heck, it's a lot easier to do it in July than on November 1st. If you want to be in a position to have new sources of revenues, it's a lot easier to be making those plans now. If you want to be considering programmatic changes, now would be the time for you to reach out to your actual beneficiaries, your customers, and have conversations with them about what programs that you provide are most important to them and how might you provide that to them even if you're facing a budgetary shortfall. Because after all, if you engage your customers in a conversation now and you find out that they really want more of this and they don't care so much about this, you might be able to course correct between now and November so that you provide more of this and provide less of that come November. Again, Betsy, that's the sort of thing when I talk about uncovering leverage points is by gathering information, you can find ways that you can serve your beneficiaries better without necessarily expending more resources in order to do it. So if we were going through this scenario planning exercise, we would be asking, what do we need to research? What can we do to increase our options? And what are our areas of greatest leverage as we consider this scenario? Again, if you were going to do this with your teams at home, it doesn't require a lot of time or energy. It requires about an hour of preparation for the leader, about 90 minutes for the group to have a discussion about the 3 questions, about 2 hours for the leader to think about and rehash and consolidate the answers. One of the good things about the current day is that you can record your Zoom session, which would make it easier for the leader to go back and look and gather data points and nuggets from the discussion. And then you'd want to have a follow-up with your group. And it doesn't have to be just the scenario we talked about today. There are lots of other scenarios. You could do a scenario in which you look at, oh, your files are held for ransom, or your CEO gets caught up and needs to go on a long hiatus. There are lots of things you can do with scenario planning. It is an incredibly powerful tool. But it's also a tool that I could go on ad nauseum about. And fortunately or unfortunately, I don't get the chance to do that. It's all the time we have today. So Callan, I'm going to turn it back to you for final words. And then I just would urge people, reach out to others, build connections, and include me and Linda on that list. Callan, back to you.
Thank you so much, Ted. What I'm going to say is first, if anybody has questions, we definitely have time. So I want to throw that out to the group, and you can feel free to drop those in the chat or to unmute yourselves. I think, there's a small enough group here. If you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, please do. But while saying that, I know my colleague Morgan is about to drop in the chat a link to a survey that helps us to just capture your feedback. Is there what gave you kind of an aha moment, or is there something you're looking for more of that we can think about and hopefully bring to you guys another time? And then final thing to share is that Ted and Linda are actually going to be back in just a few weeks to do I'm sorry. I'm trying to say scenario planning, but it's not that either. It's handling risks during economic recession. And we're doing that on August 5th at the same exact time at 2:30. So I'm going to share all of that in the follow-up email, and you'll get the link to the recording and resources. But for questions, please, any questions right now that we can ask of Ted and Linda, please feel free.
Yeah, and we'll stay as long as people have questions.
I'm just looking at the chat. I see a couple of things. Just thank you. So thank you from Karina. Thank you from Julia. Jackie.
Yeah.
Your presentation is amazing. Okay, great. I know.
I can talk about this stuff all the time, Jackie.
Yeah. um, okay. Anybody want to unmute? Anybody have questions? I know it's hard with Zoom. You have to take a second, find your mute, unmute, type your question.
Well, what I will say is anybody who would like to follow up should feel free to connect with Linda and me. We love to talk about this stuff. And yes, we do have both horror stories and tremendous successes, Chris.
So maybe you could share one with us, one of each.
Well, sure. No, I can. Let me share a good one, which is the way that an organization has used risk management in order to deal with really challenging circumstances. One of our clients is an organization that's about a $1.5 million organization. They went through an executive director transition a couple of years ago from a long-term executive director. They had an internal succession, and when they did that, they went through the process of looking at risk management as a critical tool, and they looked at, what do they expect going forward from the standpoint not of forecasting, but instead in terms of scenario planning. And based on that, they were able to set a path that has really allowed them to weather some extraordinary discontinuities. Not only the things like COVID, where they had to go virtual and they had to do enormous budget cuts, but they had thought about those issues to some extent in the past. But also, they work in an area where there have been dynamic buffeting uncertainties, both positive and negative, over the last couple of years. And by thinking about some of those scenarios as possibilities, they were able to create optionality so that when some of those opportunities came about, they were better positioned to actually take advantage of them. And when some of those threats came about, they were better prepared to hunker down like turtles and avoid the worst of it. So these things do work. The tool, you could talk about scenario planning with infinite complexity, but just as Linda and I try to keep risk management very, very simple, scenario planning, usually the simpler, the better.
Okay, any other questions from anyone out there? I see we still have people hanging on. I don't see any in the chat.
I'll ask one more.
Sure, Chris.
Not going to miss a chance. What keeps you up at night?
What keeps me up at night, I'm terrified about the November elections, Chris.
Yeah.
And the reason why I am is that I think that our nation has had such buffeting shocks over the last couple of years. And I remember back in the year 2000, when there was uncertainty between, November 6th and right around December 16th or 17th, when the Supreme Court finally shut down the Florida recount. I remember how much uncertainty there was then. And then there was no question but that William Jefferson Clinton was no longer going to be the president. Now we actually have a question mark out there that puts at stake real profound things about our democracy. And whether you are a Republican or a Democrat, a liberal or a conservative, that is a profoundly troubling thing. So if I were a nonprofit, one of the things that I would be scenario planning about, and that's one of the reasons why I had that on my list of potential topics, is scenario plan the breakdown of democracy. What happens if in the second week of November and the final week of November and the second and final week of December, we do not know who is truly the president of the United States? how does that impact your nonprofit? And what would you want to be doing then? And what do you want to be doing now in light of that potential discontinuity? That's what keeps me up at night, both as someone who deeply believes in this country and someone who also worries profoundly about the sector. That's what keeps me up at night more than anything else.
Ted, I don't know if you saw in the chat, Deirdre just asked, I keep thinking about the presentation that you did here last year called Are You Ready for a Recession, which is what we're going to repeat in August. All of those points proved to be very prescient. I'm thinking especially of the one called Make Sure You Have a Good Relationship with Your Banker. Absolutely crucial when the PPP dropped.
Deirdre, thank you so much for saying that. Now, that does not mean that every one of my predictions will come true. You know, one of the great things about doing lots of presentations is I can always point to ones where I nailed it. I don't have to point to the 7 where I just didn't get it right. But that said, yes, we're going to update that presentation for the current day, because then we had the ability to say, what if? Now we're talking about, well, what do we do now? And yes, I know that having a relationship with your banker more than ever before is absolutely critical.
As a small business, we found that out the hard way as well.
Without question, without question. So yes. Any other questions, please? And it doesn't necessarily have to be about scenario planning. It can be like Chris's, what keeps you up at night?
Might be fun to hear what keeps Linda up at night.
You know, Chris, what keeps me up at night is Ted and I have done nothing but dedicate ourselves to hoping to make the sector more resilient. And now that we know there's a recession, whereas as we were just talking about, we were merely predicting one before based on other people's data. What worries me the most right now is if I could wave a magic wand, I would want to talk to all nonprofits right away and give them tips and techniques and advice on how to make it through this next year, because we just don't want to see the kind of chaos in the sector that we think is possible. And so what keeps me awake at night is how do you save more people? How do you get more people protected in lifeboats if the ship is going to have a turbulent ride? How do you make sure everybody's got a life jacket and that it's an anti-nausea pill? So we really want to help the sector be more resilient and transmit as much information as possible so that practical tools are in your hands, not theory or, you know, we really want practical tools in people's hands, because it's become more obvious over the last decades that without nonprofits, there are a lot of people out there who would not have some of their very basic needs met. And the sector is more vital now than it ever was. So we want to make sure we keep the sector afloat in whatever ways we can contribute.
Thanks for that, Linda.
Amen. Now, I'm totally willing to keep this up. I will just say that you probably heard that our emergency warning system was going off a little bit ago, and it looks like, oh my goodness, something is on, you know, something wicked this way comes.
We'll let you go, Ted. We're going to have you back soon anyways, and we'll be following up with everyone, as I mentioned, with the recording and stuff. So thank you guys for being here today, and we'll be seeing you soon.
Fantastic. Thank you all for attending, and we look forward to the next time we interact with you.
All right. Bye, Ted.
Bye-bye now.